history leaves us with relics. Sometimes the relics are so iconic that they overshadow the actual events. But history is all about context, and the history that actually happened is often best explained as part of the history that didn't happen, but could have. Historical war games are wonderful in that they can tell multiple histories, because you can play them over and over again, and the more the game is rooted in historical context, the more you can appreciate why certain things happened, or, more importantly, why they didn't. But if a game's context excludes all but one possibility, then war games risk becoming relics as well. War games have always struggled with the line between plausible alternatives and alternate history. After all, these are supposed to be historical simulations, but how can you simulate something that never actually happened? And keep a straight face, I mean. But a medium so well suited to exploring possibilities is really shortchanged when the designer refuses to consider them. Some alternatives are easy to imagine, such as what if Khrushchev had called Kennedy's bluff during the Cuban Missile Crisis? Others are less so, such as what if Hitler had lived on the moon? But when a designer decides to make this choice, he or she has to decide how to impose that on the player. Take the Pacific War. Almost all games about this theater start with Pearl Harbor. There weren't any American aircraft carriers at Pearl Harbor when it was attacked, but that doesn't mean there couldn't have been. But if there had been, and they had been sunk, it would have dramatically changed the balance of power, making it much harder for the Allies to win. History would have gotten a lot more complicated. But a game just needs to redefine what it means to win to restore the equilibrium. This kind of moving target is often quantified by victory points, or VP, and applying a sliding scale to this is a kind of grading on a curve based on designer-imposed conditions. It's where the balance versus accuracy side of our triangle gets a workout. Are you sick of game design theory yet? I never am, but that's kind of my own problem. But what's important to understand is that while it's easy to just let Napoleon have panzers and give his opponent an extra 100 victory points, a really good designer takes into account the crux of the historical situation before deciding how to hand out rewards. The crux of the situation in Indochina was that after 8 years of war, France was tired and broke. She had accepted that there was no military solution to the war long before she parachuted over 4,000 troops into an isolated valley in northwestern Vietnam in November 1953. But while the French were looking for a political solution, the nature of this solution depended on the military situation. The great powers had scheduled a summit meeting for the spring of 1954, and on the agenda was Indochina. Both the French and the Viet Minh were desperate for a decisive military result to give them the bargaining advantage once those talks began in Geneva in late April. While the total French force at Dien Bien Phu never represented more than 5% of the overall French forces in Indochina, the battle quickly took on an outsized significance to all concerned. Everyone seemed to instinctively know that this was a fight to the finish, and that no matter how many troops the French ended up losing the battle itself would cause the collapse of the government and the evaporation of most of the remaining popular support for the war. La Vallée de la Mort was designed by Paul Rohrbaugh and published twice, 5 years apart. The first edition was released in 2001 by Microgame Design Group, while the version I'll be talking about here was released in Against the Odds magazine in 2006. Against the Odds is a magazine with a game in every issue, and, as has been the case with all magazine games, from Strategy and Tactics to The Wargamer, the quality is often uneven, since publication deadlines can sometimes snatch a game from the playtesters before it's ready. But La Vallée de la Mort had 5 years between versions, so you'd think they would have ironed out the kinks in there somewhere. It's a very graphically attractive game, but it's also one with a unique and important endorsement. I talked to designer Paul Rohrbaugh about this a few years ago on the 3 Moves Ahead podcast.
It's the only game on Dien Bien Phu that General Giap has personally endorsed and likes. When the game was first published back in 2001 by Microgame Design Group, in January of 2002, I got this real interesting email from a woman her name is Lady Borden. She was the official English language translator for General Vo Nguyen Giap in Vietnam. And she, for Tet, was looking to buy something for him as a gift, and she just Googled Dien Bien Phu and came across my game that had been published by Microgame Design Group. So she bought him a copy. He absolutely loved the game. He bought copies for all of the surviving generals. He put copies of the game in the divisional archives and the museum at Dien Bien Phu. And Lady Borden asked me to write a letter explaining how I got involved, interested in the battle and why I designed the game. And I sent it off courtesy of the embassy here in the United States. And he sent me back a very nice autographed copy of the rules and with the thank you note. And needless to say, in the family archives here. It made the newspaper here, it made the New York Times, and it was published in the Chronicle of Higher Education. And that's one of the reasons why they decided to publish it in against the odds, because of that.
I have to say that's pretty impressive. It's probably the ultimate compliment for a wargame designer to have the commanding general who won a battle endorse that designer's game about that very same battle. But before we start promoting General Giap's board game review website, I've played La Vallée de la Mort, and I think I might have a few ideas just why General Giap liked it so much. The entire length of the Nam Yum River Valley spreads out on the game's beautiful map, whose beauty is even more elusive because the artist won't release the rights for a reprint. Instead of dividing the map into hexes, the game splits it into areas, and the lack of a grid is part of what allows the art to be so evocative. Because there are relatively few areas, the strung-out nature of the central strong points is kind of lost, while the isolation of the perimeter is accentuated. Another thing that accentuates the length of the valley is the fact that the Viet Minh starting areas are really just off-map holding boxes, leaving the actual terrain at the beginning to the French. But whatever the graphic choices, the iconic battlefield with its landmarks is instantly recognizable and sets a great sense of place. La Vallée de la Mort is a magazine game, and thus has certain size limitations. One significant one is the counter mix. The most important result is that of all the Dien Bien Phu games we'll talk about, it's the only one done entirely at the battalion level. This means that the battalion is the basic game unit, and that a French battalion, which was composed of 4 separate company counters in Citadel, is just one counter in La Vallée de la Mort. Viet Minh units, on the other hand, were represented as battalions in Citadel, and are still battalions here. For some reason, the Viet Minh regiments, which were composed of 4 battalions in Citadel, have only 3 battalions in La Vallée. Since in La Vallée, individual heavy weapons companies are combined into a single regimental artillery battalion, a Viet Minh division is slightly smaller than it was in Citadel, but not by much. Because the French were so greatly outnumbered during the battle, representing equal numbers of French and Viet Minh troops with equivalent counters means that in this game, the French player will have a lot fewer units to maneuver than the Viet Minh player will. It's actually pretty lopsided. So why this obsession with scale? Who cares if one of these equals one of these or a handful of these? Because scale is the mind killer. Scale is the little death that brings total obliteration. You have to face your scale, because scale is the single most important element in a wargame. It's a tricky thing. You want to make the scale large enough to be playable, but small enough to represent a battle's important events. A scale that is too small is like looking at the Sistine Chapel frescoes through a microscope, while a scale that is too large is like trying to touch up those same frescoes with a roller brush. Units are rated for combat strength, morale, and movement, and the combat strength also indicates the number of steps a unit has. Damage is incremental. The first hit a unit takes is a disruption. Unit cohesion suffers, but no significant casualties are taken. It's like the first shock of combat, and the unit morale is reduced by 1. The second hit is marked to show a 1-point decrease in combat factor, since that unit has now been reduced by 1 step. A third hit flips the unit to its reduced strength side, and the fourth hit places a hit marker on this side. The fifth hit on a 4-step unit eliminates the unit. It's a simple way of giving granularity to the combat results. The rules themselves are actually pretty straightforward. For example, in fire combat, all you do is find the unit's combat strength, then you apply some modifiers. Then roll a 6-sided die. If the die roll is less than the unit's modified combat strength, you get a hit. No, not exactly. You have to check the errata. It's actually if you roll less than or equal to the modified strength that you get a hit. Okay, well, at least artillery bombardment is pretty straightforward. All you do is you roll 1 die for every artillery unit. You modify that die roll, and if the modified roll is a 5 or a 6, you get a hit. Sorry, you have to check the errata again. You actually roll 1 die for each step of artillery. That's quite a change. Actually, the rules are pretty confusing. It's not just that there had to be 2 separate errata sheets published for the game a few months after the magazine came out that made major rules changes. It's the fact that the way the rules are written and laid out leads to a lot of ambiguity. It's disappointing that 5 years after the game was published for the first time, that these kinds of errors have still crept in. The game starts with the French hemmed in by Viet Minh guns, although because of the scale, the central strongpoints seem a little underpopulated. But this is still a game where artillery plays a big role, and once it opens up, there are a lot of dice and a lot of casualties to take. Then it's the turn of the French aircraft to bombard those artillery positions. Oh, I forgot to mention aircraft. Yeah, it always comes back to the aircraft. There are actually a lot of French aircraft in the game, almost as many as in Citadel. With the difference in scale, this is quite striking. Fighter bombers can provide air support, or they can provide flak suppression missions, and bombers can bombard artillery positions, while transports can airdrop supplies, replacements, and airborne reinforcements. There are even American air units available. What does this have to do with Americans? The United States was deeply involved in the First Indochina War, providing billions of dollars in aid to the French, including almost the entire French transport and medium bomber force, all as part of the Eisenhower administration's policy of containment of communism. As the situation at Dien Bien Phu worsened, the French government, in its desperation, requested airstrikes from B-29 bombers and carrier aircraft in the Gulf of Tonkin to save the fortress. That's one of the major counterfactual possibilities in the game and in the historical situation. The U.S. contemplated direct military intervention on behalf of the French, and it doesn't ultimately matter that B-29 bombers flying from the Philippines almost certainly couldn't have delivered their bombs accurately enough to spare the French positions, or that a major concern was possible retaliatory intervention by the Chinese with MiG-15 jet fighters that would have completely outclassed the French Air Force, or that people like to assert that the U.S. planned to use atomic weapons at Dien Bien Phu, even though books that claim to reveal the secret U.S. plan to use atomic weapons contain no actual evidence of these secret plans. This is the kind of counterfactual possibility that many designers are afraid of, and I'm glad that Paul Rohrbaugh not only included it, but avoided going down a rabbit hole of consequences, like including rules for actual Chinese MiG jets, or Chinese ground troops and how hard it would have been to supply them, or making a separate minigame just about the Geneva negotiations. But the way the game incorporates this is significant, so we should take a look at how the mechanics work in detail in order to understand how this all tries to fit together. La Vallée de la Mort has only 11 turns, each representing a week. But a lot of things can happen because of the way the turns are structured. Each turn has a supply phase, a reinforcement phase, and then an air asset allocation phase, where the French get to figure out how many of their aircraft they can use, and for what. But the heart of the game is the strategic phase, followed by a 7-impulse assault phase, in which each player could move, fire, and assault up to 7 times. These impulses represent the 7 days of each week, and while the combat could theoretically take place in each impulse, casualties will often dictate otherwise. We'll follow the Viet Minh attacking Strongpoint Anne Marie with elements of the 304th and 308th Divisions. The strategic phase starts with artillery and air bombardment. The Viet Minh have 2 artillery units in this sector, each of which has 2 steps. This means they roll 4 dice per unit in the target zone. Each die hits on a 5 or a 6, after modifiers. French artillery can counter battery fire and commit one 105mm unit far away in Strongpoint Dominique to do so. It misses, but still spends its ammo. Now the Viet Minh fire. 4 dice per unit is a lot of rolls, and is very likely to at least disrupt both units. The 3rd Thai Battalion is first disrupted and then reduced by a step, and it only has 3 steps to begin with. A unit can only lose 1 step per bombardment, so additional hits have no effect. The 1st Foreign Legion Heavy Mortar Company can only be disrupted by this fire, because a unit can't lose its last step to artillery bombardment, and this company has just a single step. It takes a disruption and stays on the board. Now it's time for the assault phase, which consists of 7 separate impulses, each of which represents a 1 day. Units can move, and fire, or assault, but are only prevented from moving in subsequent impulses if they engaged in fire combat. This works as an incentive for the Viet Minh to make assaults. The stacking limit is 6 battalions, and engineers give bonuses in close combat, so the Viet Minh will expose 2 full regiments by crossing clear terrain in the hope of assaulting the disrupted units in Anne Marie. After movement comes the artillery and air support impulse, and the French commit 2 fighter bombers, as well as that same 105mm artillery unit, which can fire once during the strategic phase and once during the assault phase, to try and stop the Viet Minh infantry. Because this is artillery support and not bombardment, the French will roll this artillery fire against only 1 unit. Each aircraft performing air support can roll a die against a single target unit as well, if it survives anti-aircraft fire. The fighter bomber attacking the engineers comes in at low altitude for a die roll bonus at the cost of slightly increased vulnerability. The Viet Minh have 2 anti-aircraft guns adjacent and can fire at 1 aircraft each. Anti-aircraft fire and air support are very much like artillery bombardment, where you roll a die and hit on a modified 5 or 6. Unfortunately for the French, the fighter bomber attacking the engineers is shot down. The other fighter bomber evades the flak, so it can roll 1 die against the infantry battalion, but misses. Now the French roll a die for the 1-step 105mm artillery unit firing in Anne Marie's defense. The roll is modified by +1 because it is in clear terrain, and would receive another +1 if either of Anne Marie's defenders were undisrupted. But that was part of the point of the Viet Minh barrage, to disrupt them to make the crossing of clear terrain easier. The French succeed in disrupting the single battalion. Now the French could perform defensive fire, but both their units are disrupted, so they can't. The Viet Minh could perform fire combat, but the firing units could move no further this turn. Furthermore, the Viet Minh units are from 2 different divisions, and according to the Viet Minh command control rules, they cannot combine in either fire combat or assault combat against the same group of units. So only the 308th Division assaults Anne Marie, except for the disrupted unit, which can do nothing until it recovers its disruption. The engineers are from a different division as well, they're 351st, but the errata allows them to combine with units of any division. Assault combat is odds-based, but it's really all about modifiers. The Viet Minh have 10 combat factors assaulting, while the French have 3. Remember, the 3rd Thai Battalion is reduced, which are doubled to 6 because they are in a fortified area. Each side has to choose a lead unit, and those units' morale values are compared. While we have a house rule about artillery and mortar units not being able to serve as lead units, the game rules don't prohibit it. The Foreign Legion Mortar Company has a morale of 4, but is reduced to 3 by disruption. The Viet Minh's lead morale is 5, so that is a +2 to the die roll. The entire French defending force is disrupted, so that is another modifier to the die roll, as are the 2 steps or strength points of assaulting engineers. After that, we count it up. 10 to 6 is rounded down to 1-to-1 odds, +1 for each point of the 2-point lead morale difference, +2 because more than half of the defender's combat factors are disrupted, and +1 per step of engineers. That's 1-to-1 odds with a die roll modifier of +6. An 8. Adding the +6 modifier, that's cross-referenced on the assault combat chart at 1-to-1 with a final result of 14. Defender eliminated. Anne Marie falls. But that's just Monday of the assault phase, and there are 6 more days of the week. At the end of each assault impulse, units can recover disruption, so the single disrupted unit in Area 10 could be ready for further operations on Tuesday, as long as it rolled equal to or less than its printed morale. In fact, the Viet Minh could have moved units all over the map on this impulse, and in a real game that isn't a single-area combat demonstration, they certainly would have. This would give the French a lot of targets, but since artillery can only fire once per assault phase, not per impulse, they would either have to pass up a lot of targets to be able to fire later in the turn, or leave the Viet Minh unthreatened by artillery in the later impulses. And there aren't a lot of French artillery units to begin with. But even if French artillery were to disrupt all of the Viet Minh units attacking Strongpoint Elaine, for example, the high Viet Minh morale means that 2/3 of them would recover and be available for the next impulse. So, how could the French stop the Viet Minh? With their air force. In Citadel, we saw how it was the overwhelming Viet Minh artillery advantage that doomed the French, unless they could somehow counter with aircraft. In La Vallée de la Mort, we saw how it's the overwhelming Viet Minh troop advantage, exacerbated, of course, by the scale, and the fact that the troops can move every impulse, and the artillery can only fire once a turn, that causes the French to have to rely on their air power again. That just shows you how two completely different designs can arrive from opposite directions at the exact same ahistorical effect. Historically, the French thought their air power would be decisive, but it turned out to be impotent, and there was little they could do about it. Here again, in this game, the French have a chance to reverse history by using their air arm in a way that could never have happened historically. While La Vallée de la Mort may not be afraid of counterfactual history, it does include a lot of historical flavor as random events, such as Chinese advisors, American CIA pilots, and the fiery death of one of their most colorful characters, camp deserters, and ammo dump explosions, although these do seem a bit tacked on. There is a separate rule that represents the tense command situation at Dien Bien Phu, where some assert that the elite paratroop commanders formed a parachute mafia under the direction of the fortress's second-in-command, Colonel Langlais, and ended up impeding an efficient defense. But its most counterfactual element is the premise underlying the entire game. Dien Bien Phu took place right around the time of a major international peace conference, and the winner stood to decisively change the political calculus. This was the battle's grand prize, and it was essentially all or nothing. Every other Dien Bien Phu game I've seen makes the capture of the fortress the endgame victory condition. But while capturing Dien Bien Phu does end the game in La Vallée de la Mort, it doesn't necessarily win it. Instead, the game assigns victory points almost exclusively by casualties, with some bonuses depending on when, or if, Dien Bien Phu falls. What if the French hold out for the entire game? They get 10 victory points. However, detaching the capture of the fortress from the victory conditions does enable one big counterfactual: the breakout. Breakout? As the garrison at Dien Bien Phu became more and more desperate, the French began assembling forces in Laos, 50 miles to the south, to break through to the encircled fortress. These were a mix of colonial troops with French officers, as well as Hmong irregulars, and they had neither the heavy weapons nor the numbers needed to decisively tip the battle. Nevertheless, they were fresh troops, and if the battle were indeed at the tipping point when they arrived, it was thought they might be able to save the fortress. It was codenamed Operation Condor. Unfortunately, the distance and supply requirements were too great, as the French airlift was already operating at near maximum capacity, and the diversion of aircraft to supply a 4-battalion relief force would simply cost the encircled garrison badly needed supplies. As the battle turned more and more against the French, they began thinking that the Condor Force might be able to allow the garrison to make a last-minute breakout. The codename for that was Albatross. In Against the Odds magazine number 28, which appeared in 2010, La Vallée de la Mort got an expansion called Flights of Fantasy. It was exactly that, a large-scale map that depicted the forces of Operation Condor, additional defending Viet Minh units, and the terrain south of Dien Bien Phu into northern Laos. It's kind of an odd combination. The map's scale is 10 miles per inch, compared to the main game's 700 yards, and it's clearly an exercise in working within space limitations. The reward for breaking out is also small, even if the Condor force can reach the fortress. 1 victory point per rescued unit. The relief force in actuality was too weak to break through the encircling Viet Minh, and the garrison at Dien Bien Phu was too weighed down by the huge numbers of wounded and too tightly encircled by the enemy forces to have avoided a slaughter had they tried to break out. But the expansion's value is in its idea and the commitment to counterfactual possibilities rather than the gameplay itself. Sometimes, games are all about the trying. Looking at it from the perspective of our wargaming triangle, changing the endgame objective from the capture of the fortress detaches it from historical context, and adding things like US bombers radically changes the balance. But it's this detachment that allows for interesting counterfactuals, and as long as a balancing mechanism like victory points exists, it's possible to restore some equilibrium. Although in this game, the victory points don't quite push the triangle far enough. La Vallée de la Mort is handicapped by its scale, undermined by some questionable design decisions, and obfuscated by confusing rules. But I think there's a decent game in there somewhere, because the fact that the system isn't optimal for Dien Bien Phu doesn't mean it's a bad system. In fact, it's much better suited to a different battle, one that answers the fundamental question of why on earth the French chose to stand and fight in this remote valley in the first place. And you know what? That game's included in La Vallée de la Mort. In November 1952, almost exactly a year before they parachuted into Dien Bien Phu, General Raoul Salan, under pressure to guard French-occupied Laos, built a base in the western highlands about 60 miles east-southeast of Dien Bien Phu, at the village of Nha San. The French built fortified strongpoints on a ring of hills, surrounding an airstrip, into which they flew 8 battalions of Foreign Legion and colonial troops, 3 battalions of Thais, and 6 artillery batteries. They were supported by the French Air Force, which was almost 60 miles closer to its bases than it would be at Dien Bien Phu. General Giap accepted battle and launched 3 divisions at this hedgehog. They fought for almost 2 weeks. The Viet Minh took horrific casualties, and the French held. The French thought they had learned a key lesson at Nha San, which was that a forward base that was heavily fortified, backed by artillery support, and supplied by air, could hold out against much greater numbers of Viet Minh. While the French fought bravely at Nha San, they had 2 advantages they wouldn't have at Dien Bien Phu. They, and not the Viet Minh, held the high ground, and the Viet Minh had no meaningful artillery. The aptly titled An Illusion of Victory is a minigame about the Battle of Nha San and is included with La Vallée de la Mort. Since almost all the same units fought in both battles, all it needs is some special rules, as well as a map, which is neatly tucked into a corner of the La Vallée map sheet. The game covers only the main assault, which took place over 2 days, so each turn here is a day long, and each impulse represents 90 minutes. The compact map reflects the fact that the French controlled all the meaningful terrain. Victory is determined essentially the same way as in La Vallée, with the French paying in victory points to use extra air units and reinforcements, and the Viet Minh being forced to push the assault past the point of reason, or paying victory points for prudence. Paradoxically, the smaller-sized map actually works better with the battalion counters, thanks to a rule allowing the French to place them in extended deployment, which means straddling 2 areas and being able to decide which area they are actually in after the Viet Minh player moves. The French units can even continue to straddle 2 areas, contributing a fraction of their combat factors to each. This more closely reflects the nature of the fighting, in which individual companies, not whole battalions, were committed by the French side at a given time. But the most effective weapon the French have is their air and artillery support, here less threatened by Viet Minh anti-aircraft guns due to the radically different ratio between French aircraft and Viet Minh anti-aircraft in the 2 games. The aircraft and artillery are likely to disrupt many Viet Minh units, and the Viet Minh's lack of overwhelming infantry superiority demonstrates just how much this particular game system can favor the defender, and how it's the air and artillery units, and not the infantry defensive fire, that causes most of the casualties. It's not a very dynamic situation, but then again, neither was the actual battle. The balance seems to be more even in Illusion of Victory, as La Vallée de la Mort plays with a definite anti-French bias. Maybe that's why General Giap liked the game so much. I mean, if you won an important historical battle, and then played a game about it, where you played yourself, and you always won, then wouldn't that just be good history? I mean, think about it. While the Nissan game has problems of its own, like the fact that the La Vallée line of sight rules, which are used here, make zero sense in this context, or that 82mm mortars end up being just as effective as 105mm howitzers, it demonstrates what the French were trying to build at Dien Bien Phu: a well-defended base, centered on an airstrip, with commanding fortifications, and plentiful air and artillery support. The fact that it works relatively well in Nissan should teach the player a lesson in La Vallée de la Mort, that when the besieger has plentiful artillery himself, and air power is ineffective, the whole defensive concept breaks down. Instead, La Vallée de la Mort shows you, again, that the French pilots should just have tried harder. If you just can't get enough speculative history about Indochina, I suggest you read The Man Who Walked Out of Isabel by J.C. Borg, an American who spent some time in Indochina and decided to set his story of a tormented foreign legionnaire in this Vietnamese valley. Unfortunately, the only people who actually walked out of Isabel walked straight into Vietnamese captivity. Next time, we'll take a look at a different kind of history, gaming history, and see what happens when a system that's designed specifically for one battle is applied to another. Until then, we'll see you next time. And thanks for watching.